The moment should have been one she would cherish forever, a celebration filled with laughter, love, and promises of the future. 26-year-old Darion Burley stood surrounded by family and friends as blue confetti rained from above, signaling the arrival of the twin boys growing inside her. She beamed with joy, sharing her excitement online, her words filled with the kind of happiness that only an expectant mother can understand. It was a day that marked the beginning of something new, a life she never thought she would have. A dream she had long believed was out of reach. But that dream never made it past the 6-month mark. Weeks later, in the dead of night, police arrived at an abandoned car on the side of the highway. Inside, slumped in the passenger seat, was Darion, lifeless. The air inside was thick with the smell of blood and something far worse, betrayal. Between her body and the center console, officers found her wallet, inside of which was a folded sonogram picture of her unborn children. The man responsible was someone she had loved for over a decade, the father of the boys she was preparing to bring into the world. A man who had held her close at that same gender reveal party, a man she had trusted. And in the cruelest twist of fate, the weapon that ended her life, the gun pressed against the back of her head in the final moments, was one she unknowingly helped purchase. What happened between the moment Darion celebrated her future and the night she lost it all? What warning signs were ignored, and how did love turn into something so lethal? This is the story of a woman whose excitement was cut short, whose last moments were spent beside the man she once believed would be her forever. And by the time anyone realized the danger she was in, it was far too late. For 14 years, Maurice Kelso-Smith had been a presence in Darion Burley's life. Their relationship wasn't a fleeting romance. It was long, complicated, and filled with cycles of separation and reunion. To those on the outside, it might have seemed like a love story that always found its way back, but those who knew Darion best saw it differently. Maurice was 6 years older, and his influence over her was undeniable. Even when they weren't together, he always found a way back in. There was something about him that seemed unshakable, impossible to escape. He wasn't just a past love, he was a looming presence that never truly left. At first, when Darion became pregnant, it seemed like things might finally settle down between them. The news of their twins should have been a turning point, a moment of clarity that made everything else fall into place. But if anything, it made things worse. After the gender reveal in May of 2020, Maurice began to change. It wasn't subtle, it was sudden and unsettling. Those around Darion started noticing shifts in his behavior, things that couldn't be ignored. His temper was shorter, his mood swings were violent. His presence became suffocating. But the biggest concern, his drug use was getting worse. Maurice had always struggled with substances, but now his consumption had spiraled into something dangerous. He was using K2, a synthetic drug, known for its unpredictable effects, and the more he used, the more unstable he became. And then, the violence started. It wasn't just verbal arguments, it was physical abuse. At the time, Darion didn't speak out publicly about what she was going through, but the signs were there. And her social media posts hinted at a woman trying to distance herself from toxicity, from drama, from a man she should have walked away from, but didn't. She shared a post that, in hindsight, felt like a desperate attempt to hold on to the future she wanted for herself and her sons. Having 2 boys on the way, I look at my entire life differently. All the drama people tried to put me in is so beneath me. I don't care who said what or who did what. I'm so focused on being a better me for my 2 that I can't even entertain the distractions. My babies need their mama, so leave me out of y'all drama and bull. She wanted peace. She wanted a fresh start. But Maurice wasn't ready to let her go. As the weeks passed, his obsessive need for control grew stronger. He accused her of infidelity, demanded to know her whereabouts, and inserted himself into every aspect of her life. His behavior was erratic, fueled by drug use, paranoia, and a possessiveness that only tightened as her due date grew closer. The people closest to Darion were concerned, but unsure of what to do. How do you convince someone to leave a man she has loved for over a decade, the father of her unborn children, the person she has shared her future with? By late June of 2020, Maurice had crossed a line that could never be undone. He attacked Darion. Her family knew about it. They urged her to leave, but it was complicated. She was carrying his children, and before she could make a final decision about whether to walk away for good, Maurice did something that sealed her fate. He got a gun. By the final days of June in 2020, Maurice Kelso Smith was no longer just a man struggling with personal demons. He was a man preparing for something far worse. His drug use had intensified, his paranoia had deepened, and his grip on reality was slipping away. Those closest to Darion Burley had already noticed the shift. He was more aggressive, more unpredictable, and more determined than ever to maintain control over the woman who was carrying his children. Then came June 28th, the day that would change everything. Maurice had made a decision, one that would set the final pieces of his plan in motion. He wanted a gun, but there was one problem: his criminal record. His past convictions made it illegal for him to own a firearm, meaning a simple purchase was out of the question. But a man like Maurice wasn't about to let legalities stop him. If he couldn't get a gun the right way, he'd find another way. That day, Maurice turned to someone who wouldn't ask questions: Deontay Sneed, a friend who had no idea what he was about to become a part of. Maurice needed Deontay to act as a middleman, someone to buy the gun on his behalf. Deontay didn't hesitate. He agreed to help, and together, along with Darion and Deontay's 2 children, they made their way to the gun show at Will Rogers Auditorium in Fort Worth, Texas. The moment they walked into the gun show, the transaction was already unfolding. Maurice had his sights set on a .40 caliber pistol, a powerful handgun designed for precision and deadly force. When the time came to pay, an issue arose. Maurice didn't have enough money. And then came the cruelest twist of all. Darion, unknowingly financing her own death, reached into her purse and handed over $250. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She had no idea that the very gun being purchased in that moment would be the one pressed against her skull just 24 hours later. With the weapon secured, Maurice walked out of the gun show, his arm wrapped around Darion, the bag containing the pistol gripped tightly in his other hand. It was a chilling image, a man smiling beside the woman he was about to kill, carrying the very weapon that would end her life. That night, Maurice was seen cleaning the gun, handling it with an eerie sense of familiarity, as if he already knew what it was meant for. He had the weapon. Now, he just needed the moment, and within 24 hours, he would find it. The morning of June 29, 2020, began like any other. The world moved, as it always did, people commuting to work, running errands, planning their day. But for Darion Burley, time was quietly running out. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, her life would be over. That everything she had dreamed of, the future she was building, the sons she had already named, would never come to be. Maurice Kelso Smith had spent the previous night with a weapon in his possession. A gun that had been purchased with Darion's own money. The pieces were already in place, but the final act hadn't yet been carried out. He needed the right moment, the right opportunity. And as the sun rose over Fort Worth, Texas, that moment was drawing near. That morning, Maurice and Darion went out for breakfast at a Waffle House. It seemed like a normal outing, one that any couple expecting twins might have. They sat together, shared a meal, and from the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Surveillance footage later recovered from inside and outside the restaurant showed them walking out together, side by side, heading toward their car. There was no sign of distress, no visible argument. If there was tension between them, it wasn't obvious to the cameras watching. As they drove away, they noticed something was wrong with their car. One of the tires was losing air. Maurice pulled into a gas station to fill it up, but the problem wasn't going away. The tire was too damaged to last. It needed to be replaced. Instead of continuing with their day, they made their way to a discount tire location, hoping to get a new one. What happened next remains the subject of speculation, but what is known is that Maurice refused to pay for the repair. Witnesses later described him as frustrated, agitated, someone who had already made up his mind about how the rest of that day would play out. An argument broke out between him and Darion, one that no one around them understood would be her final confrontation. In the heat of that moment, Maurice made a decision that would seal both their fates. He pulled out the .40 caliber pistol, the same one purchased just a day before, and then, in an act of cold precision, he raised it, aimed, and shot Darion in the back of the head at point-blank range. She didn't even have a chance to scream. There was no time to beg, no moment for second chances. The bullet tore through her skull, killing her instantly. The two boys she carried inside her, the twins she had longed for, named, planned a future for, died with her. The act was brutal, deliberate, and final. Maurice didn't stop to process what he had done. He didn't check to see if she was still breathing. There was no hesitation, no remorse. Instead, he got back into the car, her lifeless body slumped in the passenger seat beside him, and drove away. For miles, he continued like that, a dead woman beside him, the weight of what he had done sitting in the seat next to him. But he wasn't done yet. The murder had been his first crime of the night. There was more to come, and soon he would leave behind another victim. Maurice Kelso Smith had just murdered the mother of his unborn children, but he wasn't finished. He didn't stop to process the weight of what he had done. There was no hesitation, no sign of remorse, only movement. The lifeless body of Darion Burley sat in the passenger seat, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, the bullet wound at the back of her skull marking the violent end of a life that had once been filled with so much hope. But Maurice wasn't thinking about Darion. He was thinking about himself. With his mind racing and his hands gripping the steering wheel, he knew he had a problem. A body. Evidence. A crime that couldn't be undone. He needed to get rid of it, to disappear before anyone could connect him to what had just happened. He drove for miles, the weight of his crime sitting right beside him, but he wasn't careful. He wasn't methodical. He was reckless. And that recklessness would be his undoing. Sometime after the murder, Maurice pulled off the road in Mansfield, Texas. It was there, in a moment of desperation, that he decided to abandon the car, with Darion's body still inside. He didn't try to hide her. He didn't attempt to dispose of her in some remote location. He simply left her there, like a discarded object, as if the life he had taken meant nothing. But he wasn't done committing crimes. Instead of fleeing into the shadows, Maurice needed another car, one that wasn't linked to him, one that would put distance between himself and the murder he had just committed. So he found a woman sitting in her Jeep Wrangler outside a Texas state optical clinic, completely unaware that her night was about to take a terrifying turn. Maurice pulled his gun on her, the same gun that had just ended Darion's life. He ordered her out of the vehicle at gunpoint. In the blink of an eye, she went from an ordinary bystander to a victim of a violent carjacking. She had no choice but to comply. Maurice climbed into the driver's seat, leaving yet another crime scene in his wake. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't outrun what was coming for him. Law enforcement was already closing in. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. It didn't take long for investigators to connect the abandoned vehicle containing Darion's body to Maurice himself. His name was already in the system. His criminal record wasn't clean, and when officers found him, he was desperate, frantic, and trying to erase the evidence. Maurice had made it back to his home, but instead of laying low, he was actively trying to destroy the proof of what he had done. Officers arrived to find him scrubbing the stolen Jeep, wiping down surfaces, attempting to cover his tracks. But it was too late. There was too much blood, too much evidence. Inside his home, police recovered his blood-stained clothing, physical proof of the murder. But more damning than that, they found the gun, the weapon that had been purchased with Darion's money, the same weapon that had been pressed against her skull just hours earlier. Ballistic testing would later confirm what investigators already knew. The shell casing found inside the car where Darion was murdered was a match to the gun found in Maurice's possession. There was no way out. Maurice Kelso Smith had tried to escape justice, but justice had already found him, and soon he would answer for what he had done. The case against Maurice Kelso Smith was airtight. The evidence spoke louder than any defense he could attempt to mount. The gun, the blood-stained clothes, the surveillance footage, every piece fit together perfectly, painting an unshakable picture of a man who had made a conscious, deliberate choice to end 3 lives. There was no mystery left to unravel, no questions left unanswered. The only thing left was for the law to decide his fate. Maurice was charged with capital murder, a charge that carried the highest possible penalty in the state of Texas. Prosecutors didn't need to prove intent. The facts did that on their own. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. It was cold, calculated, and final. By the time the trial began in February of 2024, nearly 4 years had passed since Darion Burley had taken her last breath. 4 years of unanswered questions for her family. 4 years of waiting for justice. And now, in a Tarrant County courtroom, the man responsible would finally face the consequences of his actions. The prosecution laid out the brutal details of Darion's final hours. The gun, the carjacking, the attempt to erase the evidence. They didn't need dramatics. The truth was damning enough. They told the jury about the gender reveal party, the plans Darion had for her sons, the hope she had held on to until the very end. They showed her final social media posts, her own words revealing a woman determined to distance herself from negativity, focused solely on the future she was trying to build. And then they revealed the most chilling detail of all. The sonogram picture found inside her wallet, tucked beside her lifeless body. A final tragic reminder of the lives that had been stolen before they even had a chance to begin. Maurice, sitting in the defendant's chair, showed no emotion. He had spent years avoiding accountability, attempting to manipulate the system, even faking intoxication and memory loss after his arrest in an effort to escape responsibility. But no amount of deception could save him now. The jury deliberated for just 3.5 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty. There would be no leniency, no second chances. Maurice Kelso Smith was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never see the outside world again. For Darion's family, it was a measure of justice, but not a victory. No court ruling could bring her back. No sentence could replace the future that had been stolen from her sons, from the people who had loved her. In the courtroom, her grieving family addressed the man who had taken everything from them. Their words were simple, but they carried the weight of unimaginable loss. There are no winners here, and they were right. Because 3 lives had been lost that day, and nothing, not even the harshest punishment, could ever change that. The gavel had fallen, the verdict had been read. Maurice Kelso Smith was led away in handcuffs, his fate sealed in a cold, windowless prison cell where he would spend the rest of his life. But for Darion Burley's family, there was no sense of relief, only the empty ache of an absence that could never be filled. Justice had been served, but justice did not bring Darion back. Every milestone that should have been celebrated, the birth of her twins, their first steps, their first words, all of it had been stolen. Instead of planning birthday parties, her family had been forced to plan a funeral. Instead of baby cribs and lullabies, there were headstones and quiet visits to a cemetery. Her parents, Olga King Burley and Darrell Burley, had lost their daughter. Her siblings, Edric, Allison, Sydney, Chanlin, and Leland, had lost their sister. And the world had lost 2 little boys, who never got to take their first breath. For them, every passing year would serve as a painful reminder of what could have been. The twins' due date, October 17, 2020, had come and gone without the celebration it should have held. Their names, Maurice Kelso Smith Jr. and Marion Kaizen Smith, would never be spoken by a mother rocking them to sleep. Their futures had been erased before they even had a chance to begin. But Darion's story doesn't end here. Her family refused to let her name fade into the silence of another tragic statistic. They turned their grief into action, speaking out about domestic violence, about the warning signs so many victims ignore, about the choices that, if recognized sooner, could save a life. Because Darion's story is not just hers. Every year, thousands of women suffer at the hands of intimate partners. The Texas Council on Family Violence reports that in 2020 alone, 204 women in Texas were murdered by a partner or ex-partner. National statistics paint an even darker reality. 67% of these cases involve a firearm. Pregnancy does not shield women from violence. It increases the danger. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, homicide is one of the leading causes of death during pregnancy, with 20% of pregnancy-related deaths resulting from murder. Studies show that women who experience abuse during pregnancy are 3 times more likely to be killed by their partner than those who are not pregnant. The presence of a firearm makes it even worse. In domestic violence situations, having access to a gun increases the risk of homicide by 500%. The signs were there, with Maurice Smith, his escalating drug use, his possessiveness, his sudden need for a firearm. Could Darion's life have been saved if someone had recognized the danger in time? It's a question that haunts many who hear her story. It's a question that might save another woman's life. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, there are people who can help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-SAFE 7233. They offer free, confidential support and can connect victims to local resources. Darion Burley should have been here today, raising her twin boys, watching them grow, celebrating their milestones. She should have had the chance to experience the joys of motherhood, the laughter of her children filling her home, the years ahead spent shaping their futures. But all of that, every moment, every possibility, was stolen in an instant. Her story is a reminder of how quickly life can change. One moment, she was celebrating the future with a man she had known for years, someone she believed would stand beside her as they raised their children together. The next, he was the very person who took that future away. It's easy to wonder how things got to that point, to ask how a man who once held her hand, smiled beside her at a gender reveal party, could later put a gun to the back of her head. But stories like Darion's happen more often than most people realize. And the truth is, it rarely happens all at once. The warning signs are there, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but too often ignored. So the question remains, how do we stop this from happening again? Domestic violence is not just a private issue. It is a societal issue, one that claims the lives of women every single day. It doesn't always start with a gunshot. It starts with control, manipulation, isolation. It starts with small acts of violence that escalate over time. And when a firearm is introduced, the chances of survival become devastatingly low. Maurice Kelso Smith will spend the rest of his life in prison, but that doesn't bring Darion back. It doesn't undo what happened on June 29, 2020. It doesn't change the fact that 2 innocent lives were ended before they even had the chance to take their first breath. But what can change is how we respond when we see the warning signs. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, don't wait until it's too late. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think justice was served in this case? Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? What signs do you think people overlook the most in dangerous relationships? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere out there, someone is living through the same nightmare Darion did, and they might not realize how much danger they're in. Your voice, your awareness, your willingness to spread this story could be the wake-up call they need before it's too late. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We bring you powerful true crime stories that need to be heard. The stories that reveal the truth behind shocking crimes and the lessons that can help prevent them from happening again. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Stay safe, stay aware. And remember, some tragedies can be prevented, but only if we choose to see the signs.